Hello and welcome to Dialogues. My guest today is an associate professor at the Department of Humanities at the Indian Institute of Technology. But he's amongst India's best-known poets writing in Indian English. He's better known as a columnist in newspapers and magazines across the country, writing on spiritual matters. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Makarand Paranjape.
Happy to be here.
Makarand, you travel widely and you experience India at many layers, and you write so sensitively about those experiences. And I remember a recent article that you wrote about an encounter with a sadhu on a train that helped you in some ways redefine your insight or understanding of what India is, what it means to be Indian and to be proud to be Indian. And this is something that keeps coming up at the 50th anniversary of India's independence. There seems to be at one level a harking back to India's glorious past. And we often wonder, what is it to be Indian? And what was this encounter with the sadhu, and what was the revelation?
Well, I'm not sure it was a revelation, but it was a very interesting insight. And basically, the sadhu was saying that when sort of people die and are waiting to be reborn, there's a great demand for India. And everyone wants to be reborn here. And so I asked him why. And he said that that's because if you're following a spiritual path, if you're trying to do sadhana, if life is really self-creation, auto-creation, sort of self-perfection, which is what we're born here for, according to him, then India is the most conducive environment for this. But the story didn't end there, as you know. I mean, so I asked him then, how is it that, everyone's trying to go off to America or England or somewhere else, or even to the Gulf? So he said, well, as soon as you're born, you've forgotten everything about, what you were like waiting to be reborn. So that what it revealed to me was that obviously there was a tension between two different approaches to life. And if one is very materialistic, let's say if one feels that the purpose of life is to, well, enjoy oneself or accumulate wealth, which is of course fine, because in our purusharthas, kama and artha are very valid as cardinal aims of life, but they're always hedged in by dharma and moksha. And people who feel that dharma is important, for them India becomes the ideal environment, because even the confusions and even the setbacks, even the difficulties at the material level can contribute to your spiritual advancement. And I remember once the Dalai Lama said, in a talk, that as you know, the Tibetans are spread all over the world, in Switzerland, many parts of Europe, America. And he says that when they come to see me, at times I give them prayer beads, specially charged prayer beads. And they're so engrossed in the kind of life they lead over there that they even forget to take their prayer beads. And the dharma has survived because it has found refuge in India, where it is a natural environment for dharma to survive and flourish. And now it's been spread all over the world. So basically what the conversation with the sadhu revealed to me was that India is not just a material reality, a geographical reality, not just a nation which is 50 years old, not even a civilization which is thousands of years old, but India is also an idea, a set of ideas. It's a metaphysic, as Raja Rao says. And if you believe that it is a metaphysic, then India stands for something. And what does it stand for? It seems to me that if America stands for liberty, then India stands for divinity. And in the world to come, we need both liberty and divinity. So that was the insight.
I think that people would argue that it was sort of out to suggest that the fact of physical suffering and deprivation was really an opportunity for people to evolve, and that was being perhaps used as a strategy to limit material development or to inhibit it in some ways. And maybe India hasn't developed in meeting the everyday practical material wants of its people because of this logic, perhaps.
I think you're right, and I think there's some truth in this. You know, it is a bit of sour grapes, because if you look at, well, the material deprivation of India, as it were, it's not very old. I mean, in medieval times, we weren't any worse off than Europe or any other country. It's only after British colonialism that the sort of all-pervasive, grinding poverty, which seems to be seen as a mark, the distinguishing mark of India, you know, as children in America are told when they waste food, don't waste food because children in India are starving. All of this is just 150 years old and already is changing. So yes, I mean, to talk about one's lofty spiritual riches and ignore the material reality is a kind of copping out. But that was not how it always was. If one looks into the history of India, we had an extremely rich material civilization, rich at all levels, you know, full of, you know, trade and commerce, going back to the Indus Valley civilization, and later on too. And, you know, beautiful clothes people wore and enjoyed food. And if you think about Banaras as a representative city, the eternal city, the city of Shiva, then Banaras is famous for many things, among which, you know, wrestling and the courtesans and music and also death. So all of these things coexist. So I would agree that India does need to strengthen its material culture, and there ought to be a kind of perfection brought to the material, which unfortunately is not there. Instead, we have a lot of shoddiness at the material level, you know, at the lower levels of our being and consciousness. Slipshod technology, shoddy stuff, you know, windows not shutting, doors creaking, you know, very low-tech lives all around us, you know, and this is so distressing and really not good for the soul either. So I do think we need a lot of material development, a lot of wealth, but of course what's important is the means that we adopt. And in our anxiety perhaps to get rich very quickly, we are really producing very shoddy work on the one hand, and on the other hand we're becoming very callous and extremely immoral, you know. Every day in the paper one reads about some scandal or the other.
Well, exactly. If we are this sacred land, why this erosion of values? You know, I think Gandhiji was holding up the value of simplicity in the context of a larger matrix of materialism, perhaps. But why this loss of values that we read about in the papers every day?
Well, the way I read it, I was just kind of going to say, you know, that I think I indicated earlier that basically it's the haste, the greed. Now, you know, you can have 2 or 3 paradigms or models. You can have a growth model such as, you know, post-Enlightenment Europe embraced, unlimited progress, increasing material prosperity, no limits to growth. And of course that leads us directly into a society which overconsumes and which basically really is a throwaway society. And you throw away everything, disposable plates, disposable razors, disposable relationships, you junk things. In the end, you perhaps are going to junk planet Earth and move to another place. So there's a dead end over there and very dangerous. Then you have a model, what one might call sustainable development, which means that, okay, you keep producing, you grow, but you don't destroy the environment, you don't waste, and you don't consume for the sake of consuming or for the sake of keeping the economy going, and you're not killing yourself with overindulgence. But there's a balance, which is also good. But you also have a third kind of paradigm, which you might call a subsistence paradigm. And I think people like Gandhiji were preaching that for a very poor country. Even sustainable growth becomes unaffordable when 50% of your population is poor. So those of us who are privileged, if we try to adopt a subsistence model as a lifestyle paradigm, then what it means is that our wealth gets spread and it's good for the country. So the voluntary poverty, the voluntary simplicity which monks practiced, in which, you know, even very, very wealthy householders, people, the Vaishyas, dedicated to making money, often led very simple, austere lives when it came to their own personal needs and practices. And Gandhiji came from a Banya background, so he had the qualities of an emperor, but the simplicity of a sannyasi, as it were. So, to answer your question, I think that the decline in values, or this, what we see, all the scams erupting, it's because of an unbridled greed. And we are forgetting not only the subsistence model, but we're also sort of forgetting the sustainable model, and we're getting into the unlimited growth paradigm, especially that class which is so conspicuous because of its consumption. And that fuels, a sort of no holds barred desire, lust for wealth. But I must say that there's a, not flip side so much as a positive side to this, which is that, look, all these things are at least coming out. Whereas in many other countries, the corruption is so endemic, so rampant, but it doesn't come out. And these are the pillars of society are never questioned. Whereas in India, because we're a free society, everybody's X-rayed. In a sense, there are no holy cows in India anymore. So the coming out of corruption is a sign of honesty.
Well, do you think that at one level there are the two systems, shall we say, the one of meeting, as Gandhiji would describe, greed, and sort of the oft quoted, now almost cliche, that there's enough for everybody's need, but perhaps not greed. Yes. And I think one model assumes a certain quality to human nature that it keeps wanting more and more and more, and so devises an economic model on the basis of ever increasing need and demand, and the hope that technology will meet that. And the other is what you described as a subsistence model that assumes that in some ways, through self-discipline and internal processing, it is possible for the individual to restrain his needs and his wants. And one is more tenable than the other. And I'm just wondering if whether the greed model may not be a more accurate description of essential human nature, and the restraining model is something that you tend to impose an external discipline.
Well, I'm always a bit sort of hesitant, cagey in generalizing about human nature. But what I would say is that that's why I said that let's not ignore the sustainable model either. For example, those people who want to live well, who want to enjoy life, who delight in material goods, possessions, and in a certain pattern of consumption, for them sustainable growth should be sufficient. What I think we need to reject is this greed paradigm that you were talking about. I think the more morally evolved people who have a greater sense of rectitude, greater self-control, they can adopt the subsistence model, and people who are more expansive, who enjoy, all the wealth that this world has, can adopt the sustainable model. I think when we talk about human nature, I think what happens, there are two things. One is that, people get spoiled. Large numbers of people, through advertising, through a certain inculcation of a lifestyle, so that they're not perhaps essentially like that, but they've been conditioned into becoming, consumptive in that sense. Mm-hmm. So we can re-educate them, and once they realize, for example, I always think of a peculiar paradox, during our colonial period, every 10 years there used to be a famine, and literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were being wiped out. And obviously this was not a random event, it had to do with certain economic policies, apart from other things. And I always wondered, how could the administrators and all the machinery that they had at their command, all the people who worked for them, how could they be blind to something like this? For example, when we think about the great famine of Bengal, 1943, caused partly by the scarcities induced by the World War, when the British bought food grains, the whole history of it, and then the prices of food soared to such an extent that farmers couldn't buy any food. Basically, all these people would walk to Calcutta and literally die on the street. Some were being fed, some were not being fed. But none of them protested. None of them said anything. And the parties were also going on. Other things in Calcutta were going on. Now, my point is very, very simple, which is that if people are shown or are faced with the consequences of their daily life choices, and when they see that these consequences can be so utterly painful, destructive to other people, I'm sure they would not pursue those lifestyles. Human nature is as amenable to compassion, to sympathy, and to sharing of suffering as it is to a blindness, as it is to self-absorption, to pursuit of pleasure, unmindful of its consequences on others. I think both these are available in human nature, and it depends on us which side of our nature we seek to activate. And the other thing which struck me was, while you were asking the question, was that there's always the capacity to change and grow and evolve in all of us. So there's a time when, yes, say a flashy car is very important to a young person, but then after a little while maybe the person thinks it's not all that important. Maybe other things are important. How else do you explain the fact that a person working in Bell Labs throws off the job and comes and works for Gandhi Peace Foundation? I know people like that, which means that there are times when we want to perhaps be blind and not think about other human beings, but then there are times when we can outgrow that.
You'd said in the early part of this conversation, you'd mentioned that perhaps we have forgotten our Indianness or what it is to be Indian. Why do you think this has happened? Is it just that the sort of veils of ignorance have been drawn across our eyes and our souls, and so now we just need to unveil that again, and the true Indian nature shall prevail?
Well, I'm not sure, Rajiv, I said we've forgotten our Indianness at all. I'm not sure I said it. Moreover, I'm not sure I believe that there is an essential Indianness. But what I believe is that India offers you an invitation to a set of values, to a philosophy, or to a set of philosophies, all of which have certain common elements. All our philosophies tend to stress, in some sense, growth, of the, not just of the personality, but growth of virtue. If you go to the Kathopanishad, the differentiation between Shreyas and Preyas, that which is pleasing and that which is good, that which is, you might say, exciting to the senses and that which leads to virtue. So if this distinction is 3,000-4,000 years old, then it creates a particular, it creates a particular orientation to life, which I find common to a whole range of philosophies, religious systems, creeds, things that people live by, which have grown and flourished in India. So I do think of India as not an essence, but as a plurality of possibilities. And you have, something which is completely contrary to what I've been talking about, the Charvaks too, a kind of materialism. But I'm not sure the Charvaks were merely Epicurean as people have pointed them out to be. All they said is that we don't believe in an afterlife, we don't believe in, the Atman, and a human being is basically largely a body which has certain needs, and if you take care of those, and if you have a life of maximum, not just pleasure, but maximum enjoyment, it's not a bad life, But even that philosophy is discredited in India, traditionally, and about the Charvaks only through those who oppose them. But my point is that I think India offers you these range of dharmic possibilities, so much so that religions which came to India were also colored by these orientations, this outlook. Now, where has it gone? That is your question. Have we forgotten what it is about? I don't think we have. I don't think so. I think that the way India operates is that, or in fact, many societies work through some cyclical processes of renewal and self-forgetting, and that the seeds of the kinds of ideas we are talking about are embedded deep in the Indian soil. And you know how seeds of plants are, some of the plants, when the environment is hostile, when there's not enough moisture, water, they develop a hard outer coating, like a cyst, which keeps them from dying. And then when it rains, they sprout. So I think that these seeds are very deeply implanted in our soil, and that they will germinate. And you know, hundreds of people have said this. Sri Aurobindo said it, and of course the Dalai Lama also said it, that the direction for the future world will come from Arya Bhumi, because ultimately people are going to realize that we need a holistic, integrated worldview if we have to save this planet, if we have to save this beautiful Vasundhara, which is our home. And obviously then people will look to those philosophies, to those ideologies, and to those beliefs which affirm life, in which affirm values such as ahimsa and truth and love and charity and compassion. And the practice of these, you know, we've had an unbroken record of these, you know. So I think that moments of self-forgetfulness are a part of the overall plan, which basically raises your, what should I say, longing for the truth to a feverish pitch. And only when it reaches that pitch can you make that crucial turn in your life. Because otherwise you just float along, you jog along, you know, with you know, the Joneses. You can't, even if you don't keep up with them. So,
but do you feel sometimes you fear in sort of your everyday being that this drought might be a long one, and the seed might just die? With the evolution of technology, the geographical spaces, in a sense, changing, the relationship between the geographical spaces have shrunk in some ways. And do you sometimes despair?
No, no. In fact, I had, you know, a little bit of autobiography here, but I found that, you know, growing up, the 70s were a difficult period for me, you know, and for my perception of the future of India, because opportunities seemed to be limited. There was the emergency. Many things happened during that period, and I was in college at that time, and it did seem as if things were bad for India. But I think the 80s was a transition period, and lots of things opened up, and I find that the 90s are definitely more optimistic. And there are many reasons for this. I mean, one reason is that, you know, the whole country is in a state of ferment now. You know, across the board, across the length and breadth of this country, you'd be amazed at the number of movements that are taking place, you know, for alternatives to what's going on. So while the sort of mainstream seems to be very strong, getting more and more powerful, I think the alternatives are also gathering force. And, you know, at the cusp of this new age, as it were, there is a millennial sense of excitement that the world is going to change. So I think that the sort of dark and depressing decades are over, they're behind us. And I think we are seeing a global warming, not just in the sense of a greenhouse effect, but a global warming towards, you know, spiritual, holistic ways of living and thinking. And this has also penetrated the heart of the West, I'm convinced. So that we're getting very interesting patterns of things which went out of India, almost dying in India, going abroad, and then coming back to us and rejuvenating us. And, you know, yoga, in the sense of Hatha Yoga, is a prime example, because it was a dying art before the West picked it up. And they did it for, of course, different reasons, to stay young and beautiful. As Demi Moore says, she wants to live for 150 years. And of course, in the same kind of body she now has. So they picked it up perhaps for the wrong reasons, but they gave it a life, an afterlife or whatever. And now yoga is common all over the world, and in India it's done very seriously too. So I think that there's no cause for alarm, and I don't certainly never feel a sense of despair.
In the context of your own personal striving and evolution, have you felt the need for a formal structured sadhana, or is life a sadhana intrinsically as it must be?
Yes, yes. I think life is a sadhana, whether you like it or not. And that's what the sadhu meant. You see, by saying that where it is recognized as such, then you have the means to automatically transform it. And where life is not recognized to be a sadhana, then you have to strive against yourself, as it were, to make it into a sadhana. And that is why practicing dharma is easy in India. That's what I began with. But I do think that certain structures are also necessary. I think that as we grow, we need to make certain choices. And if I may say so about myself, I've been a very foolish person. Most of my life, I've not really been necessarily very aware and rather obsessive about things which perhaps were not good for me or not very important in the scheme of things. But I think that a time comes in your life when you realize what is eternal, what is important, what is imperishable, and then you want to give yourself to that. And once you do that, then it's that which makes you great, noble, whatever, worthwhile, not the flux, not all the daily stuff that you go through. And that's why I think we've always thought about lives in India as being illustrative and not real, So even Gandhiji calls his autobiography my experiments with truth. In other words, his life is important only in so far as it illustrates, a seeker's striving for truth. Otherwise, it's not of value. Similarly, I think that even if one sadhana is unconscious, to make it more and more conscious and to make it more and more pervasive sort of brings us back to the idea that all life is yoga, as Sri Aurobindo said, or all life is sadhana, as Rabindranath Tagore said, but to do this consciously and not in a slipshod manner. Not to say that life is sadhana in spite of anything I do, but life is a sadhana because I'm trying to make everything I do into a sadhana. And sadhana, of course, is making, it is establishing something, and the end is siddhi, and that is what one wants.
There are a series of very sort of interesting, vital, critical concepts here. Let's just look at Gandhiji and truth. Why is the truth important? Is it important beyond just being a value because it's more honorable than lies or untruth? What is the significance of truth?
Well, it's very interesting. Gandhiji used to say for a long time that God is truth. And then he had these series of dialogues with a man called Gora, who used to live in Andhra Pradesh. He was an atheist. And at the end of it, and he found that he was being an atheist, he was practicing the kinds of values which Gandhiji endorsed. And Gandhiji then went forward with his original formulation and said that truth is God. And we know that the Buddhists don't believe in God, but I think truth is important not because it's an idea or not because it's an ethical principle, not because you're told it's not good to tell lies as a child. Truth is actually the stuff of existence, because satya comes from sat, and sat means existence, the stuff, the suchness of life is what sat is, so you can't evade it. It is all pervasive, and the nature of existence itself is truth. And ultimately, I think Gandhiji was if he were moving, you might even argue that he was moving from God is truth to truth is God, and finally truth is truth. You could possibly stretch it even, beyond truth is God. So I think truth is something which can unite us, regardless of our creeds and our beliefs. And so I think that notions of God, notions of religion sometimes divide us. But truth is something on which a spiritual person and a scientist can meet, even if they can't meet on a topic like God, because the scientist is also searching for truth, just as a spiritual seeker is in quest for truth. So I think truth is the great common ground of our being. And of course truth is very complex, because one does try in one's own life to be truthful, even in a literal sense. But then one begins to realize that sometimes it's not possible, and it's not even desirable, because and so we talk about degrees of truth and kinds of truth, and that makes everything a little more complicated. But I think I still believe in literal truth as much as possible to the utmost level, but I'm not sure that all of us can make our lives as transparent as Gandhiji did. So I think discretion is also important in life.
Another word which is sort of frequently more abused than perhaps used is the notion of dharma. Ye hamara dharm hai. What is this dharma that we keep touting and talking about, usually more ritualistically than substantially? What is your dharma or our dharma?
Oh, that's very good. Yeah, if you ask somebody, what is your dharma? It really puts him on the spot, as it were. But, the most misunderstood sense of the word dharma is to consider it as the Indian, Hindi, Sanskrit, Marathi, Gujarati equivalent of religion.
Exactly.
So when you say dharma nirpeksh, that's a very unfortunate translation, because we are not dharma nirpeksh. We are dharma sapeksh. That is, we have expectations of dharma and we have dharmic expectations of people. But we are what one might call gutta nirpeksh or sampradaya nirpeksh. That is, not one cult, not one sect, not one system is above the others. But dharma obviously means it's a total package. It's a notion of order, of cosmic order. The root, the dhatu, the dhri dhatu, it means to uphold, to sustain. So dharma is that which upholds, which sustains. And dharma has nothing to do with one's religion as such, with one's organized church or faith that one goes to. But dharma has to do with a whole way of ordering one's existence. And in that sense, I think there are different levels and different kinds of dharma. So there is the manushya dharma, the dharma of a human being, which separates us from animals, and obviously things like non-violence, ahimsa, satya, and compassion, karuna, or even non-stealing, these are a part of manushya dharma. And if one just thinks about it, then it seems that the samanya dharma or the general dharma is itself sufficient for us to lead a good life. But then there are very special dharmas enjoined upon us. Traditionally, we had the notion of the varnashram dharma, which is obviously very controversial now. But for me, what is important there is dharma and not varna or ashrama. We can dispense with varna, and in fact, you may dispense with varna as caste, but you cannot dispense with varna as profession. So suppose I'm a teacher, regardless of what caste I come from, my dharma as a teacher cannot be denied. If I'm a policeman, regardless of what caste I come from, I have a dharma as a policeman to protect. And if I'm a businessman, if I'm a trader, regardless of what my caste is, I have a dharma. Now, if I'm selling adulterated food, obviously it's against my dharma. Or if I'm taking more than legitimate profits, it's against my dharma. So, regardless of what caste I come from, and in that sense, regardless of our caste, we perform all these dharmas in the day. You see, when we say clean the toilet bowl, we are performing a particular dharma. Then when we are teaching our child, we are performing another dharma. So similarly, I mean, the ashram dharma. As a parent, I have a dharma. As a son, I have a dharma. And as a student, I had a dharma. And later on, when I'm trying to withdraw from life, simplify my life, hand over responsibility to somebody, I have a dharma. So even if you don't believe in varna and ashram, we'll still believe in professions and the stage of life.
Makarand, yes, we in so many ways struggle with trying to integrate a notion, an idea of dharma in our everyday lives without often a very clear, specific articulation of what this dharma might really be in some ways.
Yes, yes. I think that's what I was suggesting when I was saying that sometimes there's a conflict between swadharma and swabhava, or between swadharma and, say, varnashram dharma, or between swadharma and even at times manushya dharma, you know, the sadharana dharma, like Ashwatthama slaughtering, you know, the Pandav hosts at night, obviously in conflict with manav dharma of some kind. But so we are always in a state of exploration or conflict or strife, and that is what is known as the dharma sankat. We all pass through a dharma sankat in our lives, and often it can be enriching if you look at it in the right spirit, because we are saved from really terrible disasters by the choices we make. And then we also have what is called the apadkalin dharma, when times are topsy-turvy, when everything is out of gear. And perhaps India is going through a phase like that. Even the world might be going through a phase like that. Very special dharmas come into being for survival. You know, for example, a Hindu can eat beef to survive. If he's going to starve to death, that's a part of apadkalin dharma, the emergency dharma, as it were. So you're right, it's so hard to sort of discover what one's own dharma is when one is faced with so many choices and so many options, you know. But the way I look at it, once you ask me, what is your dharma? I think my dharma is the Sanatan dharma. And I mean it in both its specific sense of a dharma which is an eternal dharma, which usually we trace back to the Vedas, but it's far older than the Vedas. The Vedas are just an instantiation of it, and which carries on in a perennial stream in a certain manner up to our present time. That is my dharma. But my dharma is the Sanatan dharma in the wider sense that it is conjoined or collaborative with dharmas in all traditions. And in a more specific Indian sense, I definitely think Jainism, Buddhism, certain kinds of Marxism, liberalism, Sufism, Sikhism, all these are a part of our Sanatan tradition. But even in a wider context, I think the dharmic component in every human endeavor, finds its echo in my practice. I would like to believe. That is my notion of what my dharma is.
And yet, isn't there a risk in some ways? I know that if you surrender to the view of the larger processes of life and a different perception of time, there is a sort of a feeling, a reassurance that all will be well, ultimately. But in the shorter lifespans and in the immediacy of the present that we live with and confront, there seems to be a fear that, in a sense, the repackaging of dharma, whether it is in the popular media or in the political arena, is in some ways substantially and dangerously corrupting of it.
Yes, I mean there are dangers, but I'm always reminded of the experience that Swami Vivekananda had when he went to the Kshir Bhavani temple in Kashmir, which was obviously vandalized and the idol was broken and everything. And he was filled with a certain kind of rage, and he said that, Mother, give me the strength to protect you so that this never happens. And the reply he got as a kind of vision or a revelation was that do you protect me or do I protect you? So the question is, do we uphold and protect dharma, or does it uphold and protect us? I think dharma is bigger than us, and it's bigger than anything that we can do to spoil it. And I think there comes a time in our lives when I don't want to trivialize or discount the very painful experience of the dark night of the soul when you live through a kind of separation from your deepest source. And if I may say so, one lives through that every now and then, again and again, maybe every day also. So it's a daily struggle, but without discounting that, there comes a time in one's life when the strength, when the proof, and when the, to use a Calvinistic phrase, the irresistibility of grace becomes so firmly established that one is no longer anxious and worried. And I remember Gandhiji saying that even if nobody in the world believed as I did, even if I were absolutely alone, and if I thought that what I was doing was right, then that should be sufficient. So it doesn't matter how it is being polluted, how it is being defiled. What matters is how you and I practice it.
You've used the notion of grace, really comes from, in some ways, at least the phrasing of it, and we're using the English language, comes from the Christian tradition. With that is the notion of evil. And sometimes I wonder personally, do we confront the shall we say, the coming to the fore of evil? Is there a notion of good and evil in our concept of dharma and the processes of life? It seems to me that in our tradition, at one level, there isn't. But at the everyday experiential response, it's comforting sometimes to be able to classify something as evil, to make it livable with.
Yes. No, it's not just comforting. At times it is necessary. I mean, evil is a very serious thing. We can't neglect it or ignore it and say that in India we have no ultimate ontology for evil, and evil is only a form of ignorance, avidya. But evil is very serious, as we know from our experience of this century, the bloodiest, the most violent century in the history of humanity, century of genocides and holocausts and mass killings and untold cruelties. We cannot dismiss evil. We cannot take it lightly. I think dharma and the sort of asuric forces are indeed quite powerful, and we need to not brush them aside with a naive sense of optimism, but take them very seriously indeed, and yet have a faith in the triumph, the ultimate triumph of good over evil, because that is the way the universe has been ordered. And here, that's why I'd like to say, that it's so important, therefore, in a sense, to take sides, metaphorically speaking, to be with the Daivik Shaktis, to be on the side of, the forces of good, and in that sense, to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem.
A part of this, of the Indian solution, has been the appearance of remarkable individuals, Ramana Maharishi, Ramakrishna, Aurobindo, and people are in our own times. Who are some of these people that have impacted you profoundly? Well, let's start with the living, perhaps.
Well, there are so many, I tell you. In the last 150 years, the tradition is so strong in India. In fact, we've had one after one so many great souls treading the soil that if you just looked at what we've got in the last 150, 200 years, it's enough to last 1,000 years. But the living ones, I mean, ones with whom one is not in personal contact, but one is in proximity, one has heard them and been with them in one way or another. Great figures, of course, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and then J. Krishnamurti, whose talks I heard even as a student and later read him very, very intensely, carefully. And a little more controversial perhaps, but somebody like Satya Sai Baba, whose, again, whose ministry and whose work, if I may say so, I've been following for many, many years now.
Well, here's sort of three different kinds of people in some ways.
Yeah.
What is the common thread, perhaps, that moves you and inspires you? You have on the one hand the Dalai Lama with a mix, in a sense, who manifests his dharma with a political role for the preservation of a dharma, in a sense. Not a dharma, but a dharma. And you have Krishnamurti, who sort of completely disowned any sort of large organization, ambition, a collective following in that sense. And you have Satya Sai Baba, who, well, I shan't say claim, but at least to whom is ascribed divinity and the performing of miracles. You have three different personalities here doing three different roles. What is there that comes through?
Well, absolutely. The point is that what I've experienced is that basically there are no limitations that you can impose upon, you know, what one might call the spiritual experience. And in fact, what is very sad is that there's so much sectarianism even on this side of the fence, as it were, each one clinging to their own narrow conception. I deliberately mentioned these really diverse examples to show, to illustrate that, you know, almost incompatible things can coexist if your outlook widens. So, I mean, from Krishnamurti, whom I started reading first, and you know, whom I saw but did not meet and speak to. I was not allowed to, by the way. Anyway.
Why were you not allowed to?
Well, there's a
digression.
Bunch of people who want to prevent people from seeing these great people. You know, they want to build a wall around them and make. They're very protective. They take possession of these great people at times. And anyway, I went to Ojai, California, all the way from Illinois, even as a student, and saving money to buy the ticket and so forth, but I wasn't permitted to see him at that time. It doesn't matter. But I think the whole message of Krishnamurti is be self-reliant. And that's the message I got. What's the point of seeing me? You do it yourself and practice it. And from Krishnamurti you learn, as I see it, you learn to be critical all the time, even in spirituality. It's so important to be critical and not just be, you know, mesmerized and blinded by something. And I think from the Dalai Lama one sees why I think he's so important is because in the political arena he's perhaps the only representative, you know, like Gandhiji was, holding this path, you know, as a model for us to solve our political problems. Because usually what people say is, well, in politics this doesn't work. But we are seeing it does work even in politics. And then with Sai Baba, what you see for the first time, I think, is a kind of mass media type of phenomenon, a mass movement. It's almost, you know, it's full of vitality in the sense, the miracles and all that. But what I learned there, I mean, I was obviously very, very skeptical, you know, but the more I attended and the more I heard and saw and met, I think the way is that you're attracted by something else. You know, as the Shirdi Sai Baba once said, I give people what they want so that they can give me what I want. So we do need, in our age of Michael Jackson and all this kind of stuff, we do need such charismatic figures to attract people, to solve their problems. Now you have the Kalki avatar also being proclaimed, and I've gone there too. It's a way of drawing masses of people. And then once they get into the path, then they have to start practicing some form of sadhana. And then, you know, I must mention Pandurang Shastri Athavale of the Swadhyay movement, and then many others. And one person I must mention is Yogi Ram Surat Kumar, who lives in Tiruvannamalai. And they say in Tiruvannamalai, where Raman Maharishi lived, there's always at least 2 or 3 living sages, self-realized souls. And what I saw there is just pure love. You're touched because of love. There is no intellectual sort of fodder which you get in Krishnamurti. You know, as a person reading, a mentally active person, you're attracted. But you go to Ram Surat Kumar, and what he does is he just makes you chant Ram Naam. And you say, what good will it do? But the main thing is just the love that you get. And as you were mentioning to me in the conversation, you feel so cleansed and so light. as if your karmic burdens have been removed. And these are just some names, but there are many others, you know. And then the living presence of the great souls of the past, Sri Ramakrishna, Raman Maharishi, Sri Aurobindo, the Mother, you know, all these, I find these are living presences in my life. And what can I say? I can only say I'm grateful.
Yet to claim divinity, or to be, to use a horrible Western word, God-man or God-woman, has also become a form of exploitation. What yardstick do you use in measuring or evaluating or surrendering at the end of that process to someone as being more evolved and enlightened, and hence someone whom you can draw from and upon?
Yes, it's a very good question. You know, Sri Ramakrishna once told his disciples, you know, he said you should, like you test a coin, you know, in those days silver rupees, you had to sound them on the floor, and when they rang true, you knew they were unalloyed silver and not in some kind of adulteration. I mean, you have to try and test, and only personal experience is the yardstick. But there's a couple of things I've learned. One is that you should follow your own path, you know, in life, not be carried away, but at the same time not criticize others for the path they follow. I mean, if you don't agree with them, you know, in the spiritual path, even if you see certain kinds of errors creeping in, I don't think we have a right to judge other people. You know, I think people must discover for themselves, you know. So ultimately, you know, the same mind, the same buddhi, the same shraddha, which is itself a gift, you deploy these to experience these various people. But I think the Indian people are not so foolish, and basically those who are exploiting people in the name of dharma will soon be found out, or already found out, and they are completely forgotten. So only that which is true remains, and all that is superficial and untrue and just glitzy and you know, sort of superfluous, it vanishes.
What aspiration do you have for yourself in terms of your journey? I don't mean the ultimate goal, but what are some of the milestones perhaps on the way that you still seek?
Well, I definitely seek a self-mastery, which I haven't attained. And maybe if one follows the Gandhian path, then he believed that you could never attain it in the human body. But I think there are definite milestones, as you put it, which you do cross. And maybe one has already crossed one or two. And but the self-mastery that I seek at the moment is a state of mind which is not disturbed and is not, what should I say, it is not shaken by the cuffs and buffets of our daily existence. Basically, that which I've experienced as the truth about the world and myself, to just be able to live that out, to be able to exist at that level of consciousness and not have to descend again and again into a level where you see yourself as, you know, unable to master all these negative feelings and thoughts that emanate. And perhaps it needs a lot of tapasya, and perhaps I'm a very lazy person, but that is my aspiration, you know, to, and ultimately, of course, a life, you know, as they know, the idea of the bodhisattva vows is very important, to be able to live in such a manner that every breath one takes is for some good. It's not to live just for oneself, but to live for a larger well-being, the well-being of the whole universe, I think. But of course, I'm, as I said, a very foolish and very erring kind of person, I think, saved from the brink by I don't know what.
Grace. If we were to just extrapolate this to India, what kind of milestones do you think we might see in our own lifetimes?
Yes, I think in my own lifetime I do want to see a more prosperous India, where the disabling poverty, the kind of penury which makes life almost a curse, is removed. I want to see that happening in my lifetime. I think some good things have happened. You've been traveling all over India, and I have been traveling all over India, and we do see that the life of the common people has definitely improved. When I was growing up, most people didn't have enough clothes to wear. Now, even in villages, people are better dressed, they have more utensils, they eat better. But I want this to be spread far and wide, and the other thing I want is that I want India's inner strength and self-confidence to be restored. I want India to reassert its dignity in the comity of nations. And this doesn't just mean the dignity of the brown skin, as it were, but the dignity of this whole way of life, which is both the Shramanic and the Brahmanic. Both the Dalit and the upper caste. It's not just for one, it's for everybody. And a more equal, more egalitarian society, not necessarily by gimmicks and political stunts, but by greater sharing and cooperation. And this is my dream for India. And in the next century, I think I hope the population stabilizes and we manage to solve some of the problems which have been bothering us, and that the 21st century I definitely think belongs to Asia, and India will play a very important role in this 21st century to come.
Paranjape, thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.